The way you had to go shopping at times is you would go to the window of the store where the storekeeper would take your list of what you needed, and he'll say, that'll be $12.52 of that. You'd give him the money. He'd say, wait outside. And a few minutes later, he would then shove a box with what you ordered through the door or through the window.
This is Changing Denver, the show about our city, how much we miss it, and what it's going to be like after all this. Hey, it's Paul. I'm back. I don't have a whole new mess of episodes or anything. Haven't been working on anything really Changing Denver related, except one project that's on hold, but pretty fun, and I will probably still finish it someday. Just back for this one episode because a couple of weeks ago, Phil Goodstein emailed me from his bunker. He said he wanted to do an interview. So we did it. We set it up. We talked last week. And I should say that we eventually do get to a subject that I think everyone can relate to right now, and that's thinking about the future. But I started, though, by asking Phil what Denver was like before the 1918 flu hit. So here's his answer.
Okay, what happens on this, Robert Speer is the political boss of Denver, first elected mayor with 10 to 15,000 fraudulent votes in 1904. He is very, very patriotic. He encourages people to vote early, to vote often, to reward them for voting along the way, and eventually he pulls so many dirty deeds against the righteous good government forces that by 1912 he sees that it's hopeless for him to seek a third term. He conveniently leaves the city while reformers take charge. By 1916, the reformers have screwed up everything, partly thanks to a guy named William Sharpley. William Sharpley is a close political associate of Speer. He's from Virginia. He's a police surgeon who becomes the city's director of health under Speer. And then for a while, he's something called commissioner of health. Mm-hmm. Sharpley, in 1915, is elected the city's de facto mayor, and he does everything in his power to sabotage the city commission so Speer can stage a successful comeback as mayor in May 1916, when Sharpley thereupon again becomes the city manager of health.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got some extremely corrupt politicians running things.
Yes, and this then starts haunting what happens with the flu. Speer rapidly asserts himself on returning to City Hall, and right when he seems at the absolute peak of his power, in early May 1918, he comes down with the sniffles. And as he remains working, his health is getting worse. The eyes are watering, so forth. And after about 3 days, his top aide said, "You're going home." And they take him home over his objections. They also say, "We are calling a doctor in." Speer is a Christian Scientist that does not want a doctor treating him. But still, the physician comes in, and within 10 days, Speer is dead.
So, just to reiterate, this is Robert Speer dying of flu-like symptoms in 1918?
In May 1918, and in retrospect, the claim is he is an early victim of the flu coming through Denver. The problem with this is just like the problem we have today. Suddenly, anybody with a compromised immunity system, 85 years old, 89 years old, 76 years old, suddenly dies. They've all been attributing it to COVID-19. And have they really done the autopsies and the morphology, on this, but still, generally, it seems that an early outbreak of the flu landed up killing Robert Speer.
Yeah, today it's hard to say. I mean, I don't know how they're detecting this thing or how good those tests are, but 100 years ago, it was worse. We can say that for sure.
Yeah.
But it's conceivable. It's unclear, but it's conceivable.
Right, because he's about 65 years old at this time.
Well, this must have kicked up like a huge power vacuum because he was like a major figure and he had just come back, right?
Yeah, and there's immense sobbing about Denver has lost its father. Meanwhile, Denver is enmeshed in World War I. And the mobilization of World War I is extreme. Washington has gone out of its way to mobilize the population. And despite the constant efforts of Washington to mobilize the population, a lot of the population doesn't like the war, and suddenly they have to impose a draft because they're not getting enough volunteers for the army. Mm-hmm. And led by a former Denver resident, high-ranking politician George Creel, who's working for President Woodrow Wilson to direct something called the Office of Public Information, Washington just launches this hideous ideological mobilization. Not only are socialists arrested, women advocating suffrage are arrested, repressed, but soon the rumor is out. Is the flu the Spanish flu, or is it the German flu? And who are the leading bacteriologists of the world? They're all a bunch of Germans. And should you be taking aspirin in dealing with the flu, or is aspirin a product of Bayer, a major German pharmaceutical company? And could this be a German conspiracy to go and poison everybody in the country?
And so there are records of people in Denver politicizing the epidemic?
Every place across the country, they are politicizing the epidemic. Washington, working closely with City Hall, the state government, even has volunteer corps. You cannot go to any public meeting without hearing what is called a 4-minute man. And a 4-minute man is a volunteer that is working to build war morale enthusiasm. And it doesn't matter whether the pastor has just said the benediction, the 4-minute man gets up and gives a 4-minute speech. You have to buy bonds. You have to go and register for the draft, volunteer. You have to spy on your neighbor of this. And I hope you are not going and having any hamburger or frankfurters. Those are more German dishes. You should instead have Liberty sausage. And I hope you don't have a German Shepherd or a Dachshund. Those are German dogs. They're Liberty dogs, Liberty hounds.
All right. So war was in the air. It was on the tip of everyone's tongue. But the thing that I'm still thinking of that you just said was people would get up at public meetings to say this kind of thing. So there were public meetings happening. Was there social distancing? Were there shutdowns in Denver in 1918?
Okay, well, this is what happens as the second wave of the flu starts coming in. By October, as the disease is soaring, and it obviously seems contagious, there are indeed stay-at-home orders of a limited extent. They closed the schools, they closed church services. The way modern events follow in the past, the way you had to go shopping at times is you would go to the window of the store where the storekeeper would take your list of what you needed, and he'll say that'll be $12.52 of that. You'd give him the money. He'd say, wait outside. And a few minutes later, he would then shove a box with what you ordered through the door or through the window where people aren't going into shops itself. But at the same time...
Highly familiar, again.
But at the same time that this is going on, the war is still constantly on the mind. Like, one of the ways you sell Liberty bonds is through spectacles and mass promotions. And towards this end, to sell Liberty bonds...
Wait, hold on. Liberty bonds are being like a means of funding the war effort?
Yeah, right. That's how they pay for this. Instead of going into a debt or taxing the rich, basically everyday citizens are expected to pay their savings into bonds to Washington, which basically means that if Washington wins, the loans get repaid. If the country loses the war, tough luck.
Okay. And so the way that they were selling these bonds was mass public gatherings, you were saying?
Yeah, and typical of this is that on Saturday, October 5th, they arrange for a warplane to come flying into Cheeseman Park. 50,000 people, 1/5 of the city's population, turn out to watch the plane land 3 hours late. And as it's landing in the middle of the park, so many people swarm towards it, the pilot has to veer to keep from running over a crowd. The next Monday, they have a big war loan parade downtown that in this case gets about 25,000 people with the plane flying over it. And as the plane is taking off from Cheeseman Park, it clips some trees and almost crashes along the way. Again, it's this challenge. Does everybody stay home, or do you have to be part of the war mobilization?
So these are all opportunities. You're making the point that these are all like huge opportunities for outbreaks, for people to spread the disease.
Yeah.
And were probably a bad idea. So was that when numbers started going up for flu cases in Denver after all these gatherings?
Yeah, exactly. And the guy that lands up being sort of in the center of everything here is somebody I mentioned previously, Dr. William Sharpley, the disciple of Robert Speer. And considering that Mayor W.F.R. Mills has no dynamism, no leadership, Sharpley essentially takes over the city as the health director, dictator. And he has quite a schizophrenic personality. On the one hand, he is very, very much a medical professional there. He's telling, no, you do not take your children to the playgrounds. You keep them in your backyards of this. They don't play with their fellows. Well, what if they're living in an apartment house where there's no yard? Well, if those foreigners, especially the Italians, weren't so filthy, we wouldn't have this disease in the first place. And he's going and resorting to extreme smears of the poor, of the immigrants in the community as a whole of that.
Vulnerable populations affected most. That's also sounds familiar.
Yeah, because they are living in the most cramped quarters. And again, they don't have any place to go. In fact, the bathroom as we know it is far from universal at this time, and especially in low-income housing, you're lucky to have one toilet to a floor of an apartment house and no bathtub as such in there.
Well, you know what? One other thing that people are talking about a lot these days is the economic effect of this pandemic. Was that a big part of the discussion in 1918 as well? No,
there really is very little of that comes out at this time. And again, the war is on. We need the war manufacturing production of that itself. There's no real closing of the factories or even the white-collar workers. At the most, what City Hall does is tells employees employers stagger your hours. We don't want everybody getting off from work at 5 o'clock and getting on crowded streetcars. Let's have some people let out at 3, some at 4, some at 5, some at 6. And they do put in rules no more than 65 passengers to a streetcar compared to at peak hours. They sometimes have 100 people on that.
Right. So it was just kind of like what's causing the economic problems now is just the entire population of the world all having slightly different demand. So like the market needs to reorient. And back then there wasn't that same reorientation of lifestyles.
Well, we also didn't have casino capitalism to the same degree then. With the whole question is for the last months or years, the people in the financial industries have been admitting that the market is totally bloated, and there's going to be a correction one of these days. And there's still the question, is this cause-effect of the collapse of Wall Street, or is this a correction of some fundamental deficiencies of the whole economy? That's what's going on right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, that's a question for the historians in 100 years, right? Although I'm sure everyone's got their opinion.
Yeah.
What about the immediate effects of the flu in Denver in 1918? Is there anything you could point to as a result that might show us what's coming next today?
There's this sort of dynamic between the war and the flu, suddenly November 11th is Victory Day. And the word of victory reaches Denver at something like 1 a.m. And suddenly people pour into the streets, and they are swarming all day. Possibly as many as 200,000 of the city's 250,000 population were involved in some war victory celebration on November 11th, 1918. And then, surprise! A few days later, the rate of deaths from the flu starts soaring again. Yeah, it's early December. You start getting the disease starting to fade. And that's another thing that's happened historically with pandemics. They sweep through a population, usually to the point where they kill or infect almost everybody that they can. But then there's sort of a third wave of the flu that starts hitting in early 1919. Well, anyway, among the complications that could be a result of the flu when the city is regaining its health in 1919 is there is this extreme disillusionment with the idealisms, the hopes, the promises of the previous years. And one group that emerges amidst the debacle, promising that it's going to make Denver a 100% pure, all-American community, is the Ku Klux Klan.
I had a suspicion that was where this was going.
And among the people, community leaders who embrace the Ku Klux Klan is Mayor Sharpley along the way. That's sort of, again, one of those things. The flu wasn't the cause of the Ku Klux Klan, but again, it was just this feeling that something is so wrong, but for the most part, it was just a feeling of disgust, of survival, killing the idealism.
I mean, this is also an era of social Darwinism too, right? So like that's just the way people thought. And when a big flu comes through like it did, people would resort to what they understood of how the world worked.
To some degrees, but again, it's just this atmosphere of defeat, of false illusions. And again, typical of all of this is that already right during the peak of the flu, there's an election where the anti-Woodrow Wilson reactionary Republicans sweep the election, And in part, they sweep the elections because the Democratic candidates were not much better than the Republicans that were challenging them. There's nothing really positive that gets out of that itself. An interesting sidelight in terms.
But to use this as an example for today, and sorry for interrupting, but to use this as an example for today, we can say that the flu created conditions for change in 1918.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something we can look to today, see where that might be coming from. But you were saying?
Well, no, that's again an interesting political point about how much is the lack of supplies sheer accident, and how much does it reflect the way the medical, economic, distribution system all operate?
Yeah.
But actually, a certain sense of amnesia is another impact of the flu of 1918. And it's interesting, the flu hits right at the time Hemingway, Dos Passos, Sinclair Lewis, Upton Sinclair, F. Scott Fitzgerald, this whole generation, none of them write about the flu in their books about this epic there. There's only one novel that actually stands out in the American literary genre about the flu of 1918, and it was written by a Denver journalist, Catherine Ann Porter, Pale Horse, Pale Rider. And it's semi-autobiographical of what happens when she's living in this residential hotel at Colfax and York Street, and it's literally a sickening chronology of what happens to her. And again, this is not a book you should read if you have a weakened immunity system. It is so graphic in portraying exactly what was going on.
Okay, Phil. Thank you for that, and thank you for your time today.
Okay, good luck on the broadcast.
Appreciate it. Be well.
Bye.
Bye.